Hi, this is Paul, and Sam Harris and Doug Wilson had a conversation. And my question is if Doug Wilson understands his audience. Now, let's take this conversation straight and let's assume that for Doug Wilson, an opportunity to be on Sam Harris's podcast is an opportunity to share the gospel with an entire audience of skeptics and atheists, if that is in fact what Sam Harris's meditation slash secular Buddhist approach is. So Doug Wilson gets to be on the podcast. And when I listen to the first 20 minutes, I haven't listened to the whole thing. It's 2+ hours. I might listen to the whole thing at some point, but the whole thing is behind his membership paywall, and I balked at paying $15 for what I assume would be much more of the first 20 minutes. My question isn't who wins, because this sort of puts us back into the whole Christian atheist debate. Another interesting question is, why does Sam Harris want to do this? I think possibly, as I mentioned on Twitter, Sam Harris's stock has sunk so low that in order to resuscitate his flagging publishing career, which is what New Atheism was, the best way is to pick up Christopher Hitchens' former adversary and see if he can resuscitate some life in the old Christian versus atheist trope. Now, for Doug Wilson, I can understand the opportunity. For Doug Wilson, taking Doug Wilson straight, this is an opportunity to present the gospel to Doug Wilson's audience. And so if you want to present the gospel to Doug Wilson's audience, the first rule of public speaking, and I would say one of the first rules of preaching, is know your audience. We watched 7 years ago we watched Jordan Peterson try this. Now, in many ways, there's no getting through to Sam Harris, I don't think. I think Peterson's approach in the first staged conversation at Vancouver was about the best approach that you could take. Jordan discovered in the first conversation he didn't get anywhere. But Jordan was thinking a lot more about Sam's audience than Doug Wilson is. So Doug Wilson starts the conversation like, this one.
Rudimentary math skills. The world is about 6,000 years old. I'm a young Earth creationist. I'm an anti-Darwinist. My question would be, where is the cosmos 14 billion years old?
No, I don't think that Wilson actually did a bad job from Wilson's point of view in addressing the question of the age of the cosmos. I thought that actually was an excellent tack, but I don't know that it would land in Sam Harris's audience. I think anyone who would listen to Peugeot would understand very much where Doug Wilson was coming from with that question. But part of the teaser clip shows, obviously, what Sam Harris and his crew thought were at least the attention-getting salient points to do to Doug Wilson what we would certainly expect Sam Wilson's crew to do to Doug Wilson, which would be to frame him as a typical fundamentalist Christian boob. And Doug Wilson tries to get out of that. And Doug Wilson is a very clever man. Doug Wilson is a really smart communicator. By everything that I've seen Doug Wilson do to handle the secular media. But part of what I was astounded by was seemingly how pedestrian Wilson approached this conversation. A little bit more.
What clock are you using to calculate the age of the Earth? I believe that future school children will be looking back on our era, studying us as part of the early church.
I'm here with Doug Wilson. Doug, thanks for joining me.
And they are civil, but if you wanted to address Sam Harris's audience, would you do what Doug Wilson did? Now, my question is, was Doug Wilson just addressing his own audience on Sam Harris's podcast? Because, of course, Doug Wilson fans and many other interested people like myself, whether or not I pay $15 to listen to the whole thing, will be curious, okay, how does Doug Wilson do this? How does Doug Wilson address Sam's audience? But maybe Doug Wilson didn't even bother trying to address Sam's audience, because a big piece of Doug Wilson's shtick and a big piece of the communication strategy of many of Doug Wilson's audience is not necessarily to communicate to Sam's audience, to gain a hearing with Sam Harris's audience, to perhaps sway Sam Harris's audience to question their presuppositions. I think Jordan Peterson did that far more effectively. It could be that Doug Wilson's strategy of communication is basically to show himself not waffling, to show himself to not be winsome, to show himself to stick to his guns. But sticking to his guns is to stick to all of the talking points that Doug Wilson's own audience would cheer. Because in some ways, that's the whole game for them. The whole game is to posture and present your points big and proud in the face of Sam Harris's audience, not actually really caring whether or not Sam Harris's audience will understand or be persuaded by anything you say. Now, at the risk of sounding winsome, at the risk of sounding like a squish, I wonder how Tim Keller would have approached this conversation. Now, I'm not saying that anyone's going to influence or persuade Sam Harris at all. Watching Sam Harris, he is locked into his worldview, and Sam Harris is, I think, a more predictable speaker than Doug Wilson. I would have thought, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of trying to communicate with Sam's audience, that Doug Wilson would have had more game, that Doug Wilson could have mind read Sam Harris's audience better, that Doug Wilson could have been more eloquent. The first comment one of the first comments on this, let's see. I guess I got to remove this one and I got to add this one. One of the first comments on this, let's see if I can pull it up big enough. It boggles my mind how a person can be so eloquently spoken, yet so stupid simultaneously. If you wanted to gain an audience, if you wanted to gain a hearing from Sam Harris's audience, what tact would you take? Where would you start? Because Sam Harris opens this thing with very broad questions. Well, let's remove this one. Let's put this one back in.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So yeah, you debated my friend Christopher Hitchens back in the day. That was probably, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. Did you remember what year you did those debates?
I don't remember the year. It was a wonderful time, actually. Christopher and I got along great, actually.
Yeah, you seem to. I watched the documentary that was born.
And they did, because of course they had more time and they made it personal and they became friends. And again, I would imagine that experience. Doug Wilson's a very smart man. Doug Wilson's a very eloquent man. Doug Wilson is a master of media and communication.
Born of that collision that was literally titled Collision.
Right.
And you guys were debating, if memory serves, whether Christianity is good for the world. That was the kind of the focusing question. Yeah.
Yeah, correct.
So we probably won't recapitulate much of that.
In some ways you will, because I think that's actually a good framing. And Wilson would say something to the effect of, it depends, and he says it later in the video, it depends what morality you're using.
I mean, I think we might fall into debate on a few topics. I think that's inevitable. But what I really want to start with here is just to have you educate me and my audience about the American religious landscape. I just have a bunch of questions for you.
And that's a nice, easy opening softball that gives Wilson, again, even from, theologically, Wilson and I are cousins. We're both Reformed. We're both presuppositionalists. And so Wilson and I aren't that far. And when I hear a softball question like that, I would imagine one of the first things you actually want to address with Sam Harris is the question of, what is religion? Well, what does Doug Wilson do?
I should say you have a new book titled Frequently Shouted Questions About Christian Nationalism.
Yeah.
And again, it's a genius title. Wilson is so good at this stuff.
So we'll get into that. But just to orient us, how would you describe your approach to Christianity, and how would you differentiate it from what most Americans might think of as mainstream Christianity?
Okay, again, a very open-ended question. He gets a chance to frame his perspective of Christianity, and I would imagine Doug Wilson's definition of religion, he understands the stuff I was taught in Christian Reformed junior high, that all life is religion, that we all have presuppositions. And so Sam basically says, tell us about religion and tell us about what Americans get wrong with respect to Christianity. And now, of course, when Sam Harris is saying what Americans get wrong, Sam Harris is thinking through the mind of his own audience. How would you answer this question? And how does Doug Wilson answer this question?
If that phrase
Sure.
means much.
So in the Baskins and Robbins of Christianity, what flavor am I? Right.
Yeah.
That's a great opening line. But why don't you pivot and talk about what religion is, instead of, let's use your assumptions about what Christianity is to the Sam Harris audience, because we all pretty much know what they think Christianity is.
Yeah. Rocky Road. That's what I. Basically,
again, humorous, but how are you going to reframe religion if you're going to speak to his audience?
I grew up in an evangelical home, conservative, Bible-believing parent.
Okay, Sam Harris, we already know what he thinks of words like that. So fair enough. There's some communication going on here.
My mom had been a missionary in Japan. My father was a Navy officer who got out to do personal evangelism.
Okay, now, conservative evangelical Christians hearing that would say, Doug Wilson's parents have great credentials as Christians, as conservative Christians, as evangelicals, maybe fundamentalists, depending on how you feel about that term. That's what Doug Wilson's audience is hearing. What is Sam Harris's audience hearing? I think most of you who listen to my channel can fill that in. And I would think Doug Wilson understands what that means. But I would assert Doug Wilson is talking to his own audience. He is trying to make points with his own audience, not with Sam Harris's audience.
So I grew up in a home that was decidedly Christian and evangelical.
Okay. Now, remember, though, for Sam Harris's audience, evangelical is primarily a political frame. For Doug Wilson's audience, it's a religious frame.
Evangelical I was born in 53. Evangelical during my boyhood, prior to Jimmy Carter, simply meant conservative Bible believers outside the mainline denominations.
Okay. Does Sam Harris's audience understand the implication of the use of that word mainline? Maybe they do. Evangelicals, well, he's just framed it because he's just saying to his own audience, to a Christian audience, I'm one of the good guys. I'm on the right side of the line, because the main line is this fallen church, and I was raised on the good side of the line. He is talking to his own audience. He is not talking to Sam's audience.
There'd been a big battle in the first part of the 20th century in the main lines, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, and so on.
Okay, so now we're going to have a little lecture about church history, which again is fine. But how are you going to frame this? Because for Sam Harris's audience, anything Christian, this whole mainline evangelical thing, for much of Sam's audience is not going to be understood. For some of Sam's audience, yes, but for a lot of it, it's not understood. But again, he's addressing his own audience with this frame.
Between liberalism and what came to be called fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so again, if you know a little bit of church history, there's nothing wrong with what he's saying. He's giving a pretty standard, it's a talk that I've given to a bunch of people. But will this communicate with Sam Harris's audience? Or is Doug Wilson really, again, preaching to Christians?
And basically the liberals won and captured the...
Because what does Sam Harris's audience think he means by liberals? Are they classical liberals? Are they political liberals? Or is he framing this in terms of liberalism versus post-liberalism? Because in many ways, in terms of liberalism versus post-liberalism, Wilson is pretty much a Christian liberal in many ways, but not a theological liberal in the way that, let's say, the Christian fundamentalist dispute, Gresham, Old Princeton, Westminster. Again, Wilson is Reformed, so he knows all this stuff backwards and forwards.
The mainline denominations. The conservative believers sort of retreated into the woods and built their own alternative structure. They abandoned the seminaries and built Bible colleges, built Christian radio stations, and stayed there until the 1970s, more or less.
And again, this is a fine telling of 20th century church history that Wilson's audience will just say, yep, 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 yep. But ask yourself, how does the majority of Sam Harris's audience and Sam Harris himself interpret all of those words? Because they have a filter, and these words are passing through his filter, and probably all he's hearing is extreme conservative, extreme conservative, extreme conservative.
And I grew up in that quadrant of the Christian faith.
Mm.
In the 70s, you might say, led by Francis Schaeffer, polarized by Francis Schaeffer.
Again, does Sam Harris know who Francis Schaeffer is? I doubt it. Does Doug Wilson's audience know who Francis Schaeffer is? You bet. He's continuing just to signal to his audience, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy. But, I agree with you that Sam Harris is granite. You're not going to get anywhere, but you don't do this to convince Sam Harris. You do this to address his audience.
The conservative believers re-engaged in what became known as the culture wars, back in the days of the Moral Majority and the Christian Coalition, those folks. And that was something.
And again, culture wars, well, Sam Harris understands that. But when he says this, what is Sam Harris and his audience thinking culture wars? They're probably thinking abortion, prayer in public schools, and of course, Doug's audience is thinking the same thing. But are you gaining points with Sam Harris's audience?
Part of. And there has been, in recent years, after the election of Jimmy Carter, who was an avowed born-again Christian, there was a resurgence of people identifying themselves with evangelicalism. And
again, everything he is saying is correct. And to me and to his audience, he's just telling them 20th century political religious history. But how does Sam Harris's audience interpret this? Think about it. And many of you know, you have friends that are in that audience. You have family members that are in their audience. What are they hearing when he says these words?
It grew significantly, so maybe spectacularly, but became a movement, and then it too developed a right wing and a left wing, conservative and more moderate.
Again, many of us in this part of society know exactly what he's thinking. He's now sort of separated the accommodationists like Tim Keller, the squishes like Tim Keller, and the people who are holding the line like him and his audience, the good guys and the bad guys. But does Sam Harris and his audience care about that line?
Liberal. And the most recent iteration of it would be COVID and post-COVID, where the red-pilled evangelicals who have become more and more.
Why is he talking about them to Sam Harris? Sam Harris and his audience don't care, because whether you're on the Holy Post with Phil Vischer or you're way over in Doug Wilson's camp, how does Sam Harris's audience see all of those people? Why are you distinguishing them to Sam Harris? Does this make any evangelistic or even culture war sense unless you're just signaling to your own people and doubling down on your base?
Pronounced in their willingness to be Christian in public has coalesced, and the moderates have done what has usually been done, which is try to mute these divisions and get play well.
He's playing war among evangelicals. That's what he's doing. Now, Sam Harris is giving him time. And at the beginning of this talk, Sam Harris is nothing but a gracious host, gives him all kinds of time, and Doug Wilson wastes it, scoring points on the scoreboard of his own side and putting no points up on the scoreboard of Sam Harris's audience.
With others and try to get along as best they may. That's basically a 30,000-foot flyover of.
That's a 30,000-foot flyover over Doug Wilson's audience. He's not even addressed Sam Harris's audience.
Where I think we are.
So would you consider yourself a Christian fundamentalist?
See? Okay. So when Sam Harris asks a question, we're getting a window into Sam Harris's frame, because it's Sam Harris's frame that has molded Sam Harris's audience. And that is the frame you want to use when you're thinking about your communication. And so, well, what are some of the few words that Sam Harris knows in terms of the inside information? And there's a lot of good responses to this. And, well, what do you think Doug Wilson uses?
A biblical literalist, an absolutist. How would you differentiate those terms? And
so are you one of those crazy people that orients yourself in the world by the use of this Iron Age book? That is what Sam Harris is asking.
And
which
are you?
Yeah, that's great. I would consider myself a fundamentalist in the sense of believing the fundamentals of the Christian faith.
Okay. And again, from the posture of Doug Wilson's audience, that's a very reasonable answer, because he's trying to sort of pivot from, let's say, the list of the fundamentals that came out. Now he's going to start talking about dispensationalism. And does he adequately communicate what dispensationalism is to Sam Harris's audience?
I believe the Apostles' Creed, in other words.
And does Sam Harris's audience know the Apostles' Creed by heart? Doug Wilson's audience does.
And I believe it in the sense that it was held when it was first handed down.
Even from Doug Wilson's side of the line, that's a complicated answer. Again, I don't know how Sam Harris's audience hears that besides, oh, you believe antiquated, obsolete things.
But fundamentalist has also taken on cultural significance. So like a fundamentalist is someone who wears a black skinny necktie. And
that's clever, but you're not communicating. You're just saying fundamentalists are uncool. And in fact, well, I don't know, think about the punk rockers, think about the 80s. Those skinny neckties came back, but the 70s, of course, had the really fat neckties. But is this communicating anything? You're trying to tell Doug Wilson's audience that you're one of these now cool anti-establishment Christians. You're not part of the group that raised Francis Schaeffer.
Is a King James version only guy, and that sort of thing. That's sort of a cultural.
Okay, King James only guy. So I'm sure Sam Harris's audience will say, "Oh, you use the ESV. Oh, now I respect you."
Phenomenon. And I'm not necessarily a fundamentalist in that sense, but I do believe the fundamentals of the Christian faith.
And what does he use that time for? The fundamentals of the Christian faith. He's not scoring any points on the board on the side that Sam Harris's audience will understand.
Would describe myself as a biblical absolutist, which is not the same
Again, he's saying, well, he's communicating to his own audience. I'm a hardliner. I'm not a squish.
thing as taking the Bible literally. A biblical absolutist is someone who would take the Bible naturally, taking it.
Okay, so I don't think pivoting from all of the words that Sam Harris's audience would trigger on to using a different word naturally, but naturally has its own consequences. You're still trying to, again, Doug Wilson's audience understands what he's doing. None of this makes any sense to Sam Harris's audience.
The way it presents itself to be taken. So when Luke writes his gospel and he says at the beginning, I interviewed a bunch of eyewitnesses and I wrote it down carefully, he's presenting it as sober history. So I take it.
I think that was pretty good. I think Sam's audience would understand that. But of course, when you say sober history, you're basically saying this is where Wilson is a modernist history. And Wilson is fundamentally a modernist. And if you get, I don't know if I'll play all the way to the end of this, but he's fundamentally a modernist and a liberal.
It is sober history. Psalms that are poetry present themselves as poetry. I take it as poetry. When the book of Revelation presents itself as apocalyptic literature, I take it as apocalyptic literature and not as literal surveillance cameras of the future. So you want to take the Bible naturally and respect the genre in which it was written, whether it's history.
Again, Doug Wilson's audience is going to listen to this and say, this is good framing. This is good communication. I am differentiating myself from certain kinds of biblicists and fundamentalists and crazy literalists. That's what Doug Wilson's audience is hearing. What is Sam Harris's audience hearing? And many of you can mind read Sam Harris's audience pretty well.
Poetry, prophecy, apocalyptic.
Wrong button.
So taken naturally, does the concept of biblical inerrancy do for you? Do you think the Bible is still inerrant, but some sections can't be taken literally? Or is that how that breaks apart?
So, for example,
come on, there we go. Okay, I'm doing this in a hotel room after a conference, and so I'm not set up in my office to do this properly. But okay, Sam Harris just signaled how he understands. So inerrancy. So Sam Harris has learned a little bit. He's read a little bit about this, let's say, inerrantist controversy and thinks, but what does Sam Harris, how does he understand inerrancy? He probably thinks, okay, inerrancy means without error. Now, he hasn't read the Chicago Declaration on inerrancy. And so all of those caveats in the Chicago Declaration, which Doug Wilson knows, and many in Doug Wilson's audience knows all the little caveats many in Doug Wilson's office probably hasn't read the Chicago Statement on inerrancy. Let's see if this thing continues to work properly.
As a biblical absolutist, I believe the Bible. So I would say what the Bible intends to convey by what it.
And again, now a lot of Sam Harris's audience will say, okay, the Bible intends to convey. So what you're telling me is that the Bible as a whole is one monovocal unit and it has intentionality. And a little bit later, he's just going to say word of God. And again, all of this makes sense and is putting points on the board for Doug Wilson's side, thinking, we are communicating well. We are presenting the truth to Sam Harris's audience. Sam Harris's audience are just getting all of their presuppositions confirmed because all of the nuance, all of the understanding that Doug Wilson is communicating on this one side, they are not getting.
Wrote down, I seek to take it that way. So I seek to understand it the way it was originally intended, and then take that to the bank. But when
and even more sophisticated listeners on Doug Wilson's side, at this point, now that we've been through a lot of lecturing from postmodernists, as it was intended. And so this, again, Wilson as fundamentally a certain kind of philosophical modernist, not a theological modernist, but a philosophical modernist, is presenting the Bible in that way. And again, I'm not saying it's a bad way, but these are all points that Doug Wilson's audience are going to say, yes, yes, yes. And Sam Harris's audience is not going to understand.
When Jesus says, I am the door, I don't look for a doorknob. Or in Psalm 23, you don't have to go find a green pasture to lie down in to be a good Christian.
Now, that's a really clever thing to say. And again, Doug Wilson is very, very clever. But Sam Harris is going to call him on it and say, come on, that's, you know full well the filters I have with respect to this question.
I don't take it literally that way.
Is there anyone who takes it literally literally? I mean, I can't imagine anyone takes it.
Now, again, Sam Harris here is right. And you just let Sam Harris put points on his own side of the board with his own team. The point of this, and part of the reason why this style of debate has gone out of favor, is that the audience understands full well they are using this conversation for both sides just to put points up on their own side. That's it. That's it. That's why this kind of discussion has gone out of favor, because both sides are using the opportunity to just basically fluff up their own people. And that's all that's happening. Now, again, maybe that's the game you want to play, and that's fine. But taking this in a straightforward manner, which is not going to happen because there's no reason, but if Sam Harris were to invite me onto his podcast and ask me questions of this nature, now, I'm not saying I would succeed. I've watched Jonathan Pageau try this many times, and you can go back and see his conversation with Rationality Rules. You can go back and see his conversation with Adam Friended, who was a much more sympathetic audience, and Jonathan really struggled to communicate with him. You can go back and look at Jonathan Pageau's attempt to communicate with Brett Weinstein, and which for the most part was a failure, and it continues to be a failure. And Brett Weinstein is a much more sympathetic audience than Sam Harris. And so I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do, but you go on these things not to really persuade Sam Harris, but to gain a listening from his audience. And if you're going to gain a listening from his audience as a Reformed minister, as someone who understands presuppositions, as someone who understands knowing your audience, as someone who understands accommodation, you can look at John Calvin in that, because John Calvin talked about accommodation in his Institutes many, many times. God accommodates himself to us. Doug Wilson understands that, all of those ideas perfectly. Those are standard ideas in conservative, Reformed homiletics, that you accommodate your language to your audience in order to gain a hearing. And Doug Wilson, at least in the first 20 minutes or so that are on YouTube for free without becoming a Sam Harris Club member for $15, Doug Wilson knows this, I would assume, and he does nothing with it. Nothing. It is a missed opportunity unless you are just building your own base, preaching to your own choir. That's what I heard. So tell me what you think.